My name is Elizabeth, and I am 34 years old. Today, my world is one of clean lines, quiet confidence, and the steady, reassuring hum of a company that I built from nothing. But a decade ago, my world smelled of burnt coffee damp hallways and the metallic tang of fear. It was a world where I was a footnote in someone else's ledger, a temporary problem to be managed, a girl who was told more than once to give up and go home. I didn't, and that has made all the difference. 10 years ago, at 24, I was a fresh college graduate drowning in the kind of optimism that only survives for a few months post-graduation before reality sets in. Reality for me was a mountain of student loan debt and a part-time job as a barista that barely covered my groceries. My degree in English literature, which had once felt like a noble pursuit of knowledge, now felt like a very expensive, very useless piece of paper. The only apartment I could afford was a cramped one-bedroom in the Crestview Arms, a sad, sagging brick building that had clearly been majestic a century ago, but had since fallen into a state of managed decay. The Crestview was owned by the Harrison family, a local dynasty that had built a small real estate empire on properties just like this one. Buildings whose former grandeur allowed them to charge just enough rent to be painful, but not quite enough to force out tenants like me, who had no other options. My apartment had a radiator that clanged like a blacksmith's anvil and a window that looked out onto a solid brick wall, but it was mine. It was a foothold in a city that seemed determined to shake me loose. The Harrison family did not believe in absentee landlordship. They believed in presence and oversight, in making sure their tenants knew their place. The patriarch, Mr. Harrison, was a portly man with a perpetual sneer who would walk the halls as if inspecting a failing military barracks. His son Mark was a younger, sleeker version of his father, a man who wore expensive suits that looked out of place against the peeling paint of the building and treated every tenant interaction as a personal affront. They saw me with my second-hand furniture and my late-night returns from the coffee shop, and they saw a liability. From the very beginning, I was not a resident. I was a risk. After my first month, when my rent check was 2 days late because of a payroll error at the cafe, Mark knocked on my door. He didn't wait for me to explain. He just looked past me into my sparsely furnished living room and smirked. "Listen, Elizabeth," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "We run a business here. This isn't a charity. A lot of people want these apartments." He gestured vaguely at my threadbare sofa. "You sure you can handle this? I give you 3 months tops." His words lit a fire of shame and anger in my gut. I assured him it wouldn't happen again, and it didn't. I picked up extra shifts, started eating instant noodles for dinner 5 nights a week, and made sure my rent was always the first check I wrote. But his pronouncement had set the tone for our relationship. I became the poster child for the struggling, unworthy tenant. At the mandatory quarterly community meetings, held in the building's musty, water-stained common room, Mr. Harrison would often use me as a thinly veiled example. He'd stand before the assembled residents, a motley crew of students, artists, and elderly folks on fixed incomes, and pontificate on financial responsibility. "This city is for people who can afford it," he'd declare, his eyes sweeping the room before landing on me. "It's a place for contributors, for builders. If you find yourself struggling, if you can't make ends meet, maybe it's a sign that you should rethink your choices. There's no shame in going back to your hometown, girl. No shame at all." The word girl coming from him was not an endearment. It was a weapon designed to make me feel small, young, and foolish. And it worked. I would sit there, my face burning, my hands clenched into fists in my lap, and I would feel the weight of every resident's pitying or scornful gaze. I was the one he was talking about. The girl who couldn't pay her rent. The girl who didn't belong. After those meetings, I would retreat to my apartment, the one place where I could be invisible, and I would let the humiliation wash over me. But then, As the anger cooled and the shame subsided, I would do something else. I would open my beat-up secondhand laptop and I would get to work. Because what the Harrisons, what the entire world didn't know, was that in that small, grim apartment, I wasn't just a struggling barista. I was an architect. I was building something they could never see. My life became a study in stark contrasts, a carefully managed duality. From 6 in the morning until late in the afternoon, I was Elizabeth the barista. I wore a stained apron, forced a smile for hungover students and impatient businessmen, and lived in a world defined by the hiss of the espresso machine and the sickly sweet smell of vanilla syrup. I learned to move quickly to be efficient, to make small talk that meant nothing. I became an expert at being pleasant and forgettable. This was the life the Harrisons saw, the life they judged. It was a life of subsistence, of scraping, by a life that in their eyes confirmed their every assumption about me. But when my shift ended, I would shed that life like a snake sheds its skin. I would walk home, the exhaustion, a heavy weight on my shoulders, and the moment I closed the door to my apartment, I would become someone else entirely. In the quiet solitude of my one-bedroom sanctuary, fueled by the same cheap coffee I served all day, my real work began. My company. My dream was born out of the very struggle I was living. At the coffee shop, I saw the ecosystem of the new economy up close. I saw the freelance graphic designer trying to build a portfolio by redesigning our menus for free coffee. I saw the owner of the bakery next door desperate for someone to build her a simple website, but unable to afford the high fees of a design agency. I saw a world full of talented people with skills to offer, and small businesses in desperate need of those skills, but there was no efficient, trustworthy bridge between them. That bridge was what I was building. I called it bridge work. The idea was simple: an app that would act as a hyper-local, streamlined platform connecting small, independent businesses with a curated network of freelance professionals. It wasn't just another gig work site. It would be different. It would have transparent pricing, a secure payment system, and a review process that valued quality and reliability above all else. It would empower the little guys on both sides of the transaction. The only problem was I knew nothing about building an app. My literature degree hadn't prepared me for the cold, unforgiving logic of programming. So I taught myself. My nights were spent hunched over my laptop, the screen's glow illuminating my tiny kitchen table, which served as my desk. I waded through dense online tutorials, my brain aching as I tried to wrap my head around Python and JavaScript. I haunted online forums asking clumsy beginner questions that were sometimes met with helpful advice and sometimes with derision from anonymous smarter-than-thou coders. There were so many moments of abject failure. I spent a whole week trying to fix a bug in my user login screen, a problem that a seasoned developer could have solved in 5 minutes. I once accidentally wiped out a month's worth of code because I didn't understand proper backup protocols. I sat on my floor and cried, surrounded by the silent, mocking walls of my apartment, convinced that the Harrisons were right, that I was in over my head, a fool chasing an impossible dream. But the anger and humiliation were a powerful fuel. Every time Mark Harrison gave me a sneering look in the hallway, every time I saw a condescending notice about maintaining building standards slipped under my door, I would pour that frustration into my work. Their contempt became my motivation. Their disbelief in me solidified my belief in myself. I lived on a diet of instant noodles and sheer stubborn will. My social life evaporated. My friends stopped calling, tired of my constant refusals. I became a ghost in my own life, haunting the space between the coffee shop and my laptop. The only progress was the slow, incremental growth of my project. A login screen that finally worked, a messaging feature that didn't crash, a payment portal that securely processed a test transaction. Each small victory was a lifeline, a whisper of encouragement in the overwhelming silence of my solitary work. For 2 years, this was my reality. Day after day, night after night. I was living a double life, and the thing I was building in the dark, was becoming more real to me than the world that judged me so harshly every single day. After nearly 2 years of solitary caffeine-fueled labor, Bridgework existed. It was a clumsy, fragile thing full of bugs and held together by the digital equivalent of duct tape and prayer. But it was functional. It was time to see if it could survive in the wild. With trembling hands, I launched a small, hyperlocal beta version, limiting it to a 5-block radius around my apartment. I printed out a handful of flyers at the local library, and feeling like a fool, pinned them up in the coffee shop, the bakery next door, and a few other small businesses in the neighborhood. The flyer was simple: need help with a small project, design, writing, web support, find local trusted freelancers, Bridgework, sign up for our free beta. I expected nothing. I went to bed that night convinced this was the final humiliating step in a long line of failures. The next morning, I had 3 signups. One was the bakery owner I knew. The second was a freelance illustrator who lived a few blocks away. The third was a man named David Chen. His business was listed as Chen's Custom Guitars, a small workshop that built and repaired high-end instruments. A few days later, I saw a project posted. Chen's Custom Guitars needed someone to design a new logo and a set of business cards. A few hours after that, the illustrator submitted a bid. I watched the entire interaction unfold through my admin panel, my heart pounding. They messaged back and forth. They agreed on a price. The project was completed. Payment was made through my system. It worked. A real transaction between 2 strangers had just happened on the platform I had built. The feeling was so overwhelming, so validating, that I had to sit on my floor for 10 minutes just to catch my breath. A week later, I got an email. It was from David Chen. "Hi," it read. "I used your app to hire a designer. The process was great, the designer was fantastic, but your UI is a mess and the back end seems a little shaky. The core idea, however, is brilliant. I've built and sold a couple of small tech companies over the years. I'd love to buy you a coffee and talk about what you've got here. No strings attached." I read the email 5 times. I was sure it was a prank, but a quick search for David Chen revealed he was exactly who he said he was. A well-respected semi-retired developer who had quietly and successfully exited 2 software startups. He was a legend in the local tech scene, known for his sharp mind and his no-nonsense attitude. He was offering me a barista who had learned to code from YouTube videos his time. We met at a coffee shop, not mine, thankfully, across town. I was so nervous I could barely speak. I expected him to be like Mark Harrison, to see my inexperience and dismiss me. But David was different. He was a quiet, thoughtful man in his 50s, with kind eyes and a calm demeanor. He didn't ask about my education or my background. He asked about my vision. He wanted to know why I had built Bridgework. I found myself telling him everything about the bakery owner, about the struggling freelancers, about my belief in empowering small, local economies. He listened intently, nodding his gaze, never leaving mine. For the first time, I was talking about my passion with someone who understood the language. When I was done, he smiled. "You're not a barista who dabbles in tech, Elizabeth," he said. "You're a founder. You've just been working with the wrong tools. You've identified a real pain point and you've built a real solution. It's rough, but the foundation is solid." For the next hour, he gave me more valuable advice than I had gleaned from 2 years of online tutorials. He pointed out the critical flaws in my code that were making it unstable. He sketched out a new, cleaner user flow on a napkin. He told me to stop thinking about a 5-block radius and to start thinking about a 5-city radius. "Don't build for where you are," he told me. "Build for where you're going." He saw my potential when no one else had, not even me, not really. He didn't offer money or a job. He offered something far more valuable: validation. He saw past the struggling tenant and the tired barista and saw the architect underneath. I walked out of that coffee shop, feeling like I had been given a new set of eyes. The path ahead was still daunting, but for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. I had a mentor. I had a blueprint, and I had a fire inside me that was no longer just about anger and shame. It was about proving him right. Armed with David's advice and a renewed sense of purpose, I dove back into my work with a ferocity I hadn't known I possessed. His mentorship was a catalyst. He never told me what to do, but he had a way of asking questions that led me to the answers myself. Our weekly coffee meetings became my anchor, a masterclass in strategy, product development, and business acumen. He taught me how to think like a CEO, even when my company consisted of just me, my laptop, and a growing number of empty instant noodle cups. I spent the next 6 months completely rebuilding Bridgework from the ground up. I followed the user flow he had sketched on that napkin. I rewrote thousands of lines of my clumsy self-taught code, making it cleaner, faster, and more scalable. It was the hardest work of my life. I barely slept, my world shrinking to the 4 walls of my apartment and the infinite complex universe inside my computer. During this time, the pressure from the Harrisons intensified. They had begun a campaign of building improvements, which was a transparent excuse to harass the long-term, low-rent tenants. There were sudden, unannounced inspections notices about trivial violations, a plant pot on a windowsill, a welcome mat deemed a tripping hazard, and constant, unsubtle reminders of their power. The underlying message was clear. They wanted people like me out so they could do a cheap cosmetic renovation and double the rent. Mark Harrison seemed to take a special pleasure in my discomfort. He would catch me in the hallway on my way to my barista job and give me a pitying look. "Still at it, huh?" he'd say, gesturing at my coffee-stained apron. "You know there's a booming market for people with real skills, just some friendly advice." He was poking at my biggest insecurity, the fear that I was wasting my life, and I hated him for it. But every sneer, every condescending remark became another line of code, another hour of work. I was building my escape brick by digital brick. After 6 months of relentless effort, the new Bridgework was ready. It was fast, it was intuitive, it was beautiful. David looked at the final version and gave a rare, wide smile. "Now you're ready to fly," he said. He encouraged me to apply to a prestigious tech accelerator program, a 3-month boot camp for promising startups that culminated in a demo day, where founders pitched their companies to a room full of venture capitalists. Getting in was a long shot, but I poured my heart into the application. To my astonishment, I was accepted. The program was in another city, which meant I had to quit my job and give up my apartment. I packed my few belongings into a couple of boxes and sent out my 30-day notice to the Harrisons. On my last day, I dropped my keys in the management office slot. I didn't see them, and for that, I was grateful. I walked away from the Crestview Arms without a backward glance, the feeling of liberation so potent, it was dizzying. The accelerator was a whirlwind. I was surrounded by brilliant, ambitious people, and for the first time, I didn't feel like an imposter. I was one of them. I honed my pitch, refined my business model, and worked with mentors who were legends in the industry. The 3 months flew by in a blur of hard work and sleepless nights. Then came demo day. I stood on a brightly lit stage in front of a theater packed with some of the most powerful investors in the world. I wore a simple second-hand blazer I'd bought for the occasion. My heart was hammering, but as I started to speak, a strange calm came over me. I wasn't the struggling barista anymore. I wasn't the scared tenant. I was the founder of Bridgework. I told my story. I talked about the bakery owner and the freelance illustrator. I showed them the platform I had built. I laid out my vision for a future where small businesses and independent professionals could thrive together. When I finished, there was a beat of silence, and then the room erupted in applause. The aftermath was a chaotic swarm of activity. Investors crowded around me, pressing their business cards into my hand, their eyes alight with excitement. They didn't see a girl who couldn't pay her rent. They saw a massive market opportunity. They saw a founder with grit and a vision they could sell. That night, the offers started rolling in. It was a bidding war. The numbers were surreal amounts of money I couldn't even comprehend. In the end, I chose to partner with a well-respected venture capital firm that not only offered a generous seed investment, but also shared my core mission. The day the first wire transfer hit the new corporate bank account I had set up, I just stared at the number on the screen. It was more money than my entire family had probably seen in their lives. The life of instant noodles was over. The struggle for survival had ended. A new struggle, the struggle of building a real company, was about to begin. I had my funding, I had my team, and I had a world to build. The 3 years following that first round of funding were a compressed, dizzying education in how to be a CEO. The transition from a solitary coder to the leader of a rapidly growing team was the most challenging thing I had ever done. The loneliness of my apartment was replaced by the chaotic energy of our first real office, a rented space above a warehouse with mismatched desks and a whiteboard that was perpetually covered in frantic scrawls. The problems were different now. Instead of fixing a software bug, I was trying to build a company culture. Instead of worrying about my own rent, I was responsible for making payroll for my first 5 employees. I hired a small, brilliant team people who were drawn to Bridgeworks' mission and who weren't afraid of the frantic, all-consuming pace of a startup. David Chen agreed to join my board of directors, his calm, steadying presence a constant source of guidance. We grew at a pace that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Bridgework launched officially in 3 cities, then 10, then 50. The platform, which had started as a simple bridge between a baker and an illustrator, was now facilitating thousands of projects every week. We were getting press in major tech journals. I was featured in an article on Female Founders to Watch, my picture, printed next to a quote about the importance of empowering local economies. I kept a copy of the magazine, but I never showed it to anyone. My past life, the life of the Crestview Arms, felt like it had belonged to another person. I had built a wall between that past and my present, and I had no desire to tear it down. The world of the Harrisons and the world of Bridgework were separate universes, and I intended to keep them that way. The success of the platform allowed me to implement policies that were a direct reflection of my own experiences. We were ruthless about our payment system, ensuring freelancers were paid on time every time. We created a small business grant program using a portion of our profits to help new entrepreneurs get off the ground. We championed fair wages and transparent contracts. Every feature we built, every policy we enacted, was a quiet correction to the kind of casual cruelty and systemic unfairness I had experienced firsthand. My work was no longer fueled by anger, but by a deep, abiding desire to build a more equitable system. I was in my own way becoming the kind of landlord I had always wished I'd had, a facilitator, not a gatekeeper. As the company grew, so did my life. I moved into a comfortable modern apartment in a new part of the city. I traded my diet of instant noodles for meals at restaurants I could now actually afford. But I never fell into the trap of lavish spending. The memory of my financial precarity was too fresh, too raw. I drove a modest car and dressed in simple functional clothes. On paper, I was wealthy. In my head, I was still the girl who had to count every penny. That quiet fear never entirely went away, but now it served as a reminder, a grounding force that kept me focused on what truly mattered: the work. One evening, I was driving home from a long day at the office and took a different route, a nostalgic whim I couldn't explain. I found myself on the familiar tree-lined street of my old neighborhood. And there it was, the Crestview Arms. It looked exactly the same, a little more tired, a little more saggy, the same sad, neglected air hanging over it. I pulled my car over to the side of the road and just looked at it. I expected to feel a surge of anger, or maybe a satisfying jolt of triumph. Instead, I felt a strange, hollow sadness. I thought of the people still living inside the students, the elderly residents, the young dreamers like me, all subject to the whims of the Harrisons, all living with the low-grade anxiety that comes from housing insecurity. The building wasn't just a symbol of my past humiliation. It was an ongoing problem, a small pocket of unfairness in a city full of them. I felt a sense of responsibility that surprised me. I had escaped. But what about them? The thought lingered, a small, persistent seed planted in the back of my mind. I started my car and drove away, but the image of the Crestview Arms and the feeling it evoked stayed with me. A few months later, that lingering thought resurfaced in the most unexpected way. My company, Bridgework, was looking to make its first major real estate investment. We had outgrown our warehouse office, and our CFO was presenting options for a new headquarters. As part of the portfolio, he also included a list of potential income-generating properties we could acquire as part of a new investment arm of the company. It was a logical next step in our growth, a way to diversify our assets. I was listening with half an ear as he clicked through a slideshow of sleek modern office buildings and promising commercial lots. And then a new slide appeared on the screen. It was a picture of a familiar sagging brick building. My building. The Crestview Arms. My CFO cleared his throat. "This one's a bit of a wild card," he said. "It's an older residential property, the Crestview Arms. It's in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, so the land value is high. The current owners, a family firm called Harrison Properties, have run it into the ground, and now they're looking to cash out. It's being sold, as is a bit of a fixer-upper, but our projections show that with a significant capital investment, we could turn it into a very profitable luxury apartment complex." He talked about gut renovations, high-end finishes, and a projected 300% rent increase. He was from a purely financial perspective making a sound argument. A profound silence fell over the conference room as I stared at the picture on the screen. All the memories came flooding back with a visceral, gut-punching clarity. Mr. Harrison's sneering voice at the community meeting. Mark's condescending smirk, the feeling of utter powerlessness as I counted out my rent money. The humiliation was so vivid, it was like a taste in my mouth. My team looked at me confused by my silence. They saw a rundown building and a balance sheet. I saw a battleground. I saw the place where I had been forged. My first instinct was pure, unadulterated revenge. The idea of buying their building, the symbol of their small-time tyranny, and evicting them from their legacy, was a fantasy so potent it made me dizzy. I could be everything they were, but better, richer, more powerful. I could show them what a real empire looked like. But as the fantasy crested, it broke against something harder, something more real within me. What would that accomplish? It would make me just like them. It would be an empty victory, a performance for an audience I no longer cared about. The anger I felt was real, but it was an old anger. It belonged to a younger, more vulnerable version of myself. The woman I was, now the CEO of Bridgework, had different motivations. A new idea began to form, an idea born not of vengeance, but of purpose. What if I bought the building not to tear it down, but to build it up? What if I turned a place of anxiety and neglect into a place of security and respect? What if I could offer the tenants the one thing I had never had there, a landlord who saw them as people, not as numbers on a spreadsheet? It was a crazy idea from a business perspective. It meant sacrificing the maximum possible profit for something less tangible. But it felt right. It felt like the perfect expression of everything Bridgework stood for. It was closing a loop, not just for me, but for the community that had in its own way been the crucible for my company's mission. I looked at my CFO, my voice calm and decisive. "Make an offer," I said, "but not through bridge work directly. Use our holding company, the one we use for quiet acquisitions. I don't want my name anywhere near it until the deal is closed." My CFO looked confused. "Elizabeth, the numbers for a luxury conversion are solid, but—" "We're not doing a luxury conversion," I interrupted gently. "We're going to renovate the building, but we're keeping the existing tenants. We're going to sign them all to new long-term leases with minimal rent increases tied to the rate of inflation. We're going to build a new community room. We're going to treat it as a model for ethical property management." My team stared at me dumbfounded. It was a move that made no financial sense. But then David Chen, sitting at the end of the table, a quiet presence in all our major meetings, began to smile. He didn't say anything, but he looked at me, and his eyes held the same look of recognition they had held in that coffee shop all those years ago. He understood. This wasn't just a real estate deal. This was a statement. This was the culmination of my entire journey. "Make an all-cash offer," I said, my voice firm. 20% above their asking price. I want this to be quick, clean, and undeniable. I want them to take the deal without a second thought. The day of the final closing, I decided to go to the handover meeting myself. My legal team had handled all the negotiations through the anonymous holding company, and the Harrisons had no idea who the true buyer was. They believed they were selling to a faceless corporate entity that would, as they probably would have done, immediately clear out the tenants and begin a lucrative luxury redevelopment. They had taken our generous all-cash offer with greedy delight, no questions asked. My CFO advised me against going. "Let the lawyers handle it, Elizabeth. There's no reason for you to be there." But I knew I had to be. This wasn't just a transaction. It was a reckoning not for them, but for me. It was about standing in that place of my former humiliation, not as a victim, but as the architect of the outcome. I chose my outfit carefully. I didn't wear a power suit or anything that screamed CEO. I wore a simple, well-made dress, flat shoes, and minimal makeup. I wanted to look like myself, the woman I had become, calm, confident, and utterly unconcerned with impressing them. As I drove to the Crestview Arms, a strange sense of peace settled over me. The building looked just as it always had, tired and weathered. But I saw it differently now. I saw the good bones beneath the neglect, the potential beneath the decay. I saw home. The meeting was held in the small, cramped management office where I had once stood, heart-pounding, trying to explain my late rent check. The Harrisons' father and son were already there, sitting behind their large, imposing desk. They looked pleased with themselves, like two cats who had just cornered a particularly plump canary. They were celebrating the final, profitable shedding of their old, problem-riddled property. They gave me a cursory, dismissive glance as I entered with my lead counsel, assuming I was a junior associate or a paralegal. "All right, let's get this over with," Mr. Harrison said gruffly, looking at my lawyer. "Where's the representative from the holding company? We just need to sign the final papers and hand over the keys." My lawyer, a sharp, impeccably dressed woman named Maria, placed her briefcase on the desk. "The representative is here," she said, her voice neutral. She gestured to me. "Gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to your new owner. This is Elizabeth." I watched as their brains tried to process the information. The name Elizabeth clearly meant nothing to them. They saw me a familiar-looking young woman, but the context was all wrong. Mark was the first to make the connection. His smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, like a television screen losing its signal. His eyes narrowed as he stared at me, really stared at me for the first time. I could see the exact moment the memory clicked into place. The struggling barista, the girl in the back of the community meetings, the tenant he'd condescendingly offered 3 months in. "Elizabeth?" He stammered, his voice a full octave higher than usual. "Elizabeth who lived in 4B? The very same." I said, my voice quiet even. I offered a small, polite smile. The blood drained from his face. He looked at his father, who was still staring at me with blank incomprehension. "Dad," Mark whispered, his voice hoarse. "It's her, the girl from the coffee shop." Mr. Harrison's florid face went from pink to a blotchy, alarming shade of white. He looked at me, at my simple dress, at my calm demeanor, and his mind, like his son's, finally bridged the impossible gap. His jaw went slack. The pen he was holding slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the desk. The silence in the small office was absolute, thick with the weight of their shattered reality. They were not just looking at a former tenant. They were looking at the ghost of every person they had ever underestimated, every person they had ever dismissed, every person they had ever tried to make feel small. And that ghost now owned their building. But how?" Mr. Harrison finally managed to say, his voice a choked whisper. "The buyer was Bridgework Holdings." "That's right," Maria, my lawyer, said smoothly, stepping in. "And Elizabeth is the founder and CEO of Bridgework." The name of the company seemed to land on them like a physical blow. Bridgework wasn't just some faceless corporation. It was one of the city's biggest startup success stories, a company whose rapid growth was the stuff of local business legend. They were looking at the struggling girl who couldn't pay her rent, and they were seeing a titan of industry they should have recognized from the newspapers. They had been so insulated by their own arrogance, so secure in their judgment of me, that they had missed the story of the decade happening right under their noses. They saw a charity case while the rest of the world saw a visionary. I let them sit with that realization, with the dizzying, nauseating vertigo of their own profound miscalculation. I didn't gloat. I didn't say, "I told you so." I didn't have to. The quiet, undeniable fact of my presence in that chair on that side of the desk was the only statement that mattered. After the signing was complete, after the keys were officially in my possession, I stood up. The Harrisons remained seated, looking like two deflated balloons, their blustering self-importance completely gone. "If you'll join me," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "there are a few things I'd like to discuss regarding the transition." I led the way out of the cramped office and down the hall to the drab, musty community room where Mr. Harrison had held his quarterly lectures on personal responsibility, the very room where he had told me to go back to my hometown. The power dynamic had been so completely inverted, it was almost surreal. I took a seat at the head of the long, folding table, the position he had always occupied. They sat opposite me, two humbled, silent men. "I wanted to let you know our plans for the building." I began, my hands folded calmly on the table before me. "I know the sale was contingent on the property being delivered with the existing tenants, and I want to assure you we will be honoring that." I saw a flicker of something in Mark's eyes, cynicism, disbelief. He likely assumed I was lying, that the mass evictions would begin the following week. "In fact," I continued, "we're going to be making some changes to how we manage the building." This was the line I had rehearsed in my head, the line that contained the entirety of my victory, a victory not of revenge, but of correction. My company will be investing significantly in capital improvements. New wiring, new plumbing, a new roof. We'll be renovating the common areas and adding new amenities for the residents. We will also be offering every current tenant a new 5-year lease. The rent will be frozen for the first year, with subsequent annual increases capped at the city's official rate of inflation. I let that sink in. I was describing a business model that was the polar opposite of their own. Their model was built on neglect and exploitation, on squeezing every last penny out of a depreciating asset while pushing people out. Mine would be built on investment stability and respect. It was a complete and total repudiation of everything they stood for, delivered not with anger, but with the calm, unshakable authority of a balance sheet. But why? Mark finally blurted out the question, a mixture of genuine confusion and desperation. You could make a fortune here. You could triple the rents. He was still trying to understand my actions through his own lens of greed. He couldn't comprehend a motive that wasn't purely financial. I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see the smug tormentor from my past. I saw a small man with a small imagination, trapped in a worldview so narrow he couldn't see anything outside of it. Because it's a better way to do business, I said simply. Because happy, secure tenants are better for the community, and because I know what it feels like to live here and worry about making rent every month. No one in one of my buildings will ever have to feel that way. That was the final blow. I had not only surpassed them in wealth and power, but I was now judging them on a moral and ethical level, and finding them wanting. I had taken their cruelty and used it as a blueprint for my own kindness. There was nothing left for them to say. I stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. My management team will be in touch tomorrow to handle the operational transition, I said. Thank you for your time. I walked out of that room, out of that building, and into the bright afternoon sun. I didn't look back. I didn't feel the surge of triumphant adrenaline I had once fantasized about. I felt a profound sense of quiet. The ghosts of the Crestview Arms, the ghosts of my own shame and insecurity were finally at rest. I hadn't bought the building to show them. I had bought it to show myself. To show the scared 24-year-old girl who lived on instant noodles and coded through the night that her struggle had meant something, that her vision was real, that her compassion was not a weakness, but a strength. Their shock, their humiliation, it was all just noise. The real victory was the silence in my own heart, the quiet, unshakable peace of knowing I had become the person I had needed most back when it all began. And now I could be that person for someone else.